you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right, so I'm going to be reading a few poems from my chapbook, What Is Left Behind, Garden Elegies. And I think just kind of as a preface, these poems are written, of course, as elegies, but they're kind of remembrances too. And they're of the women in my family who were very good gardeners, had very good green thumbs, which I don't always possess, but they did. And so it's about the flowers they raised and kind of how I got to know them through that, because there's these huge generation gaps in my family. For instance, my grandmother on my dad's side was born in 1890, and my grandmother on my mom's side was born in 1905, so I didn't really get to know them. And so that's what these poems are about, in a way, is getting to know them through the flowers they raised and that I later saw. And you know, the ones that were my grandmother's were on the same farm where I grew up, so I got to tend them as well. So with that being said, the first poem is called What Is Left Behind. It's the title piece, and it's in 5 little short parts. 1, your gardens to walk through years after I sang Holy, Holy, loyal as a sword of iris, heavy with the scent of vesper flowers still thick in my hair. 2, the hope that you might return, vulnerable again in the skin, with your eyes blue, with your eyes brown, your hands, as I remember, adorned with silver bands, and your hands unadorned but filled with violet petals. 3, signs that you cannot be silenced, the fires in your roots still burning in my veins, and the dreams of your crooked, thin lips smile, opening like a rosebud to confess, and then your full lips pressed against my ear, soft as a daylily. 4, my endeavor to unravel the delicate stitching of your sweet violets, pansies, ferns sewn along the trellis, so I can find my way to you with feverfew bound tightly to my wrist. 5, your marigolds, heliotropes gathering in the garden, thick with the scents of crabapple, sweet rocket, all these things left behind, yet still breathing you. This next poem and the ones that follow it, they also kind of play with the idea that flowers have a language of their own, and that there's a lot of lore and legends associated with flowers. And so each one of these begins with an epigraph that talks about that. So this poem, Irises, begins with the epigraph. The Greek would often plant an iris on the graves of their beloved women as a tribute to the goddess Iris, whose duty was to take the souls of women to the Elysian fields. Now I walk the border of the garden between the swords of loyal Iris, with shears in my hands, remembering last year's August, how we were shadowed by this overlook of cedar, thinking ahead to May, placing the roots in the rich soil. I stood then with a shovel, and you handed me the rough-fingered roots gently, knowing the tubers were tender with life. We were thinking about the idea of another spring, picturing bearded petals with deep purple potential and lavenders as faint as skyline, inclining to blue rain. Now I'm writing you a message with the petals, inscribing wisdom, valor, and honor, remembering how as barefoot with the earth drying and tracing the lines of my feet, you said you used to have feet like mine with long, smooth toes. Now I place the petals above your brow. I look down and see my shoes reflected in the headstone's cool granite, and I try to trace the roots that creep undetected beneath the skin. Thank you. I'm going to read another poem from this collection called Daffodils, because it makes me think of spring, and I want spring so badly. I think I'm not the only one. And it looks like it out there, which is great. So the epigraph that precedes this poem says the name Narcissus comes from the Greek word meaning to numb. Out the window, the daffodil blooms you planted in the fall have forced their green stems through the thawing soil. I write, can almost feel the petals fall across my face. Last fall I felt so optimistic. The daffodils are bending to catch their reflections in the leftover snow. They are caught somewhere between spring and winter. I write, this morning I wanted to walk into the garden and be numbed by the fragrance. Now the dawn edges its gray light onto the 2 smooth sheets of the bed. Your stationery feels starchy beneath my hands. I write, I must be caught somewhere between. The raw edges of spring are pushing up against my soil. The ink in my pen is difficult, a scratchy voice from my tight throat. Thank you. I'm going to backtrack just a little to a poem called Marigolds. And this one borrows from Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale for its epigraph, and it says, the marigold that goes to bed with the sun, and with him rises weeping. Familiar to me, I tend your marigolds, hardy stems, thick with pungent odor, as September's rich decay bruises under my thumb. I think of you, tending the marigolds, their gold and darkening heads, crimson against the white stucco of the house. I tend what is left, careful to avoid the fragile roots. I tend knowing you would prefer the crimson over the gold, yet knowing nothing more, as my hands catch on the stems thick with trickery, against frost, drought, against my knowing you threw the marigolds you left, stationed around the house, fragile soldiers left to protect what is within. Just one more piece from this collection and then move into a little something different. This is the final piece, and I think it's one of my favorites because it's about my favorite flower, pansies. Again, this borrows from Shakespeare's Hamlet this time, and the epigraph says, and there's pansies, that's for thoughts. Stutter, stuttering, petals on my tongue, stinging nettles. This is me coming through the rushes, my skirts heavy, weeping willow for hair, moss rooted on my feet, falter, faltering, roses in my mouth, confessing desire for honeybees, sun, prickling needles of you. Not leaving, I have not left yet, language returning slowly, violets in my throat, pain, pander, pense to think. I could be hopeful, greedy seed catalog in January, seasons ahead in thought, panther face pansies, I'm wearing your face in my veins, baby Lucia, sky blue, cold tolerant, blues jam, blue shades and bicolors, crystal bowls, 9 colors, early, many flower, heat tolerant, Famacimi, purple edge and blotch with white between, Pad Paraja, intense orange, name for orange sapphire, queen of the planets, early, large, dark blotches, Spanish sun, tangerine orange, Ullswater blue, Genetian blue, black blotch of my feet spilled out the blooms and roots, green stalks, eyelashes and nerves, faces you said in a pansy I could find, heavy, too heavy for the stem. Once you told me this, but I am tangled, untangling creeper vine. I am outside the garden, looking beyond. Thanks, I'm gonna move from the flowers a little bit. And I have a poem here that's kind of on its own right now, but it's called A How-To Guide to Painting, and it comes from all the work we've been doing with kind of home ownership stuff and upkeep, all those fun things. And the fascination with this idea came from, I was searching for paint colors, and they're so poetic when you start looking at different paint chips and what they're called, and so this plays with that idea. A How-To Guide to Painting. The painter said, you need to learn something about technique and about how to avoid the messes you're always getting yourself into, the sags of paint running down your walls, the darker color always bleeding through. Little Red Riding Hood's cape is not the best choice, my dear, for a southern lit bedroom. You want a cooler color, perhaps Bluebird Morning, Wings of Pegasus, or September Aster, something with less heat, less passion, he said. And here's another thing, you just can't open a can of paint and haphazardly slap it onto the walls. You need to learn that every can of paint is composed of its own nature, and every brush has its own personality. Eggshell is not high gloss, and natural hair is not the same as synthetic. There are consequences to making such assumptions. You must learn to mask, to cut in, to cross-coat, to feather. You must learn patience, to let the wall breathe and cure before painting another coat. Maybe then, if you've been careful enough, you will have a masterpiece. You have learned how to avoid curtains of Bluebird Morning running down the walls like permanently unchecked azure streams. You have learned to avoid hollowed out fish-eye craters pooling in the corners, the crow's feet etching down from the ceiling like unintended consequences. You have learned something about discipline. Thank you. This next set of poems here, I was looking for kind of some themes, and they're love poems, but there's two that are about people, and there's one that's about a tree, and then there's another one that are about avocados, so they're a real mixed bunch. So anyway, I'll read the first one, the first two, which are kind of more traditional love poems. Waiting for the shutter to close. At the stream's edge, you posed with one hand casual upon your knee, a flannel shirt tied around your waist, and I let the camera keep the record of how the mountain's outcroppings were softened by the hesitant light of the just before dark sun. Let the green turning gold leaves finger your smooth boned cheeks, brush across your chin, and settle into the frame of the picture still before I could move to fit myself next to you. Thank you. This next piece is called Seasons of Fire, and it's in 5 different parts, and it kind of goes through the year. It starts with winter, and it ends with winter, and again, it's another love poem. 1, winter. Twitter-patered snow tumbles into characters scratched out on my front porch. The language of cold is indecipherable to your warm-blooded heart that beats out a heated syntax to match my own. Freezing rain today, increasing the weight of my 22-gram soul. The unaccountable becomes accountable in this liquid freeze. The barbed wire nettles with ice, each wiry thorn magnified and unmovable and unremovable as my love. 2, spring. The ice has melted with a blaze of 7 red cardinals, and the purple of crocus gives way to the golden narcissism of daffodils, and we will keep giving away, and we will keep taking until we are reflections of each other. The hell-bent horizon this evening is part cloud, part smoke. We kindle and we rage. We watch the sun bury itself in more fire, and we only know that we couldn't help ourselves. 3, summer. Baking sun, making a heating plate out of my garden. This is what it means to live as a flowering orchid on a high, dry plain when the waters ran too far east and too far west. This is what it means, you say, to smolder. I know we'll cook until we're done. 4, autumn. The fall foliage warms the cool gray sky. The maples explode, the ash devours the cool-limbed aspen. We walk into the mouth of the leaves of fire, and as fire catches hold, we clasp our hands. We gaze without longing at the cool fog that drenches the river. 5, winter again. The wind howls tonight like a line full of celestial sheets left hanging out to dry, not beat down flannel or 300 count, but silk, rippling and flailing as we smash the stars into ashes of rhinestone and tinsel. The apocalyptic sky burnishes stratospheres into gold dust and saffron for us to season our living. These spices warm our Decembers. I warn you about adding too much to the mix, but you just keep stirring. This is how we always return, folding and unfolding. Okay, this next poem I'm moving into the love poems that aren't about people, but this one's about a tree. And this is about one of those great cottonwood trees that's about 100 years old, and it always has the best asparagus growing under it, and I always try to get there first. So this is called Preservation, a love poem. That tree is more mine than yours, through the very laws of love and adoration. Its boughs, roots, and branches reaching beyond property lines, beyond laws of ownership. Its value more than an extra half acre of corn, or 20 bushels of soybeans, or a convenient driveway into your field. Because that cottonwood tree is more its own than anyone else's. It's a cosmic placeholder. Its boughs keep the immense prairie sky from falling, preventing a catastrophe of jumbled clouds and disoriented stars. Its roots anchor down the plains so we are not set adrift by the undulating rhythm of a sea of grass. Its branches harvest the wind, catch the melodies of cheerful meadowlarks and raspy katydids. Its twigs mingle the cadence of rain with the soft percussion of snow to compose the song of our collective history, to reassure us of our continued survival. This song gathers in the leaves, pulses in the trunk, reverberates to the roots, creates a tempo meant to awaken the wilderness still left beating in our own untamed hearts. Okay, so this is probably the strangest one of that set. This is the avocado one, and it's called Reflections on an Alligator Pear, which is another name for avocados. And another name I discovered in South America, and I'm not going to try the Spanish, but it means the apple of winter, which I thought was kind of nice. So, Reflections on an Alligator Pear. Resting in the palm of my hand, the avocado sets like a small olive green boulder, its rough surface dimpled, appearing hardly edible, despite sticker number 4046's insistence that it'll be ripe when soft. There is nothing quite like unhusking a perfect fruit, cutting through the skin firm like pleather, slipping the skin from the cool, damp fruit, mining out the perfectly round seed. It must be something like discovering a secret tropical island, taking its sand between your fingers, letting the wind catch the grains and whispering that the world is yours. Cutting into an avocado is an act of faith. You never know what inhabits its innermost regions. You hope for a lime green heart, creamy and rich in flavor, but my gingerly squeeze is not always an effective test. Perhaps because I'm a no-coaster, unfamiliar with sun-ripened leaves and blue trace beaches, I can't tell the difference between soft and too soft, between just right and too ripe. I have perhaps coasted along too long on high windy seas of corn and highways of wide open skies. One time in college, I meant to impress my parents with my sophisticated palate, so I brought an avocado home. I thought it was ripe. I'd waited, stayed the course, advised by the label, ripe when soft. When the time came, I knifed into the fruit, myself ripe with expectations, only to find the center hard, unmashable, unsuitable for guacamole or human consumption. We tried to eat it anyway, but my parents never tried another avocado and still remain suspicious of my taste. I used to mash an avocado and mix it with guacamole seasoning or sour cream, but not now. I prefer to simply slice the fruit, place it directly on my tortilla, my turkey sandwich, my scrambled eggs. I like to taste it for what it is. Thank you. I'm going to finish with just a couple more poems, and these are about my mom. And as some of you may know, she's been in very poor health the last couple years, so these poems kind of address that. The first one's called Scores of Blackbirds. I heard them before I saw them, those rioting voices, that bold choir of 1,000 blackbirds descending upon the neighborhood, perching on leafless trees, on rooftops of suburban houses, this last afternoon before daylight savings, before the final march out of winter. There must have been 1,000 at least, or so it seemed, gliding out of the sky like black-winged 8th and 16th notes, unfurling themselves from sheets and sheets of musical scores to darken the field. I didn't try to count them, but I called you and said, there were hundreds of blackbirds, maybe thousands, on the west side of my street. Have you seen any blackbirds? You say no, but that it must be a sign of spring. You say their voices sound like running water. I think how they must puddle the sky. You say the first calf was born today, an all-black one. You went into town to see Mom at the nursing home yesterday. She was confused. She asked how her parents and sister were. You had to explain how her parents had been gone for years, her sister not so long. How? She asks. You don't know how to answer. She asks if you're planning on farming again this year, how the cattle are. It's like she's waking up from a deep slumber, a long dream where the threads of reality entwine with ghosts of the past into a ball too confusing to unravel. It must be like the voices of so many blackbirds trying to speak at once, descanting from these leafless branches, dotting the corn stubble with their eighth note wings. The field outside my window looks even more barren now that they've gone, but I know they must have left something behind. I'm going to read one more. This will be my final piece. This one, again, is for my mother, and it's called The Night We Saw the Northern Lights. Do you remember the night we walked out into January's moonlight? We'd left the rest of the family behind in the warmth of the farmhouse as our boots crunched against the fragments of gravel and ice, my short steps rushing to match your longer stride. Together, we walked far enough away from the shelter belt that cradled our farm from the northern wind, but blocked our view of the northern sky, until we stood in the middle of the road under crystal stars and distant galaxies, hoping to see the northern lights warm the winter sky with their flashes of red and pink, yellow and green. Suddenly, a golden gleam began to fracture the darkness, and as it grew steadier, I leaned closer to you, feeling the strange beauty of the moment haloed around us. The horizon aglow with possibilities, the constellations suspended above us, endless. We stood, companions in immense solitude, until the light defined itself. Two distinct headlights crested over the hilltop. Accompanied by an engine's hum, we turned to each other, panicked. Do you remember how you told me to follow you as we slipped stealthily into the ditch? How we laid down side by side in the winter grasses, the earthy smell of decaying leaves, the discomfort of fallen branches pressing against our backs. How we laid perfectly still, our breath frozen in our throats, waiting in that suspended moment for the car to pass by. Do you remember how we have laughed for years about the night we saw the northern lights, our own cosmic joke? I will remember it for us, the breathy excitement, the endless possibilities, the way the light cascaded across the sky.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Up next, second reader. Again, we'll have her read, and then we'll take a short 5-minute break and start with the other two. Traci Brimhall is the author of... Thank you. Came out of Copper Canyon 2017, Our Lady of the Ruins, Norton 2012, Rookery, Southern Illinois University Press in 2010. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, Slate, Poetry, The Believer, The New Republic, and Best American Poetry. She received fellowships from Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing and the National Endowment for the Arts. She's an assistant professor of creative writing at Kansas State University. So she drove all the way up from Kansas for this, so I'm glad you made the drive. So let's put your hands together and welcome Traci.
This space is like my favorite, and I wish that my English department had a lounge space like this, and I totally put 2 of those puzzle pieces in, so I'm sorry that I took away that opportunity. I just couldn't help myself. I'm really happy to be here. I remember when I saw something on, I think it was Facebook or some other social media, and I was like, what? There's things for writers on the plains? I'm lonely out here. Let's go hang out. So I'm happy to be here with all of you on the plains. And I saw this beautiful picture down here, and I was like, yes, that's what my drive looked like. It's actually quite beautiful, and I actually kind of like it in winter, where there's still just mounds of snow and ice. So my unpronounceable book, saudade, that word is a Portuguese word. If you were Portuguese, like from Portugal, you'd say saudade. In Brazilian Portuguese, it's pronounced saudade. And my mom's from Brazil, and I started writing this book, and I was like, this isn't about my mom. This isn't about my mom. This isn't about my mom. Even though it's like based in the town that she's from, I was like, this is not about my mom. but it still used like little stories that she told, and I would sort of make them a lot cooler. So my mom was a really bad storyteller. So like, I always wanted her to make things more dramatic. I mean, she was a slightly dramatic person, but not about the stories that I thought were really cool. So like when she was younger, she was chopping firewood with a machete. I had like much easier chores than she did. And she accidentally partially severed her middle finger, and so she had to be like rode up to a doctor, because there was no doctor in her town, to like have it sewed back on. And this was I couldn't believe this story. Like, what? You did what? And then what happened? And then, oh my gosh. And so her version of the story was just really boring, and I felt like a child in peril, and like you'd severed your finger, and there was no doctor, and you had to go to this place. Wasn't cool enough. So there's often a seed of one of my mother's stories in the book, but I took little things that she told me, and I was like, I'm gonna make this really cool. And so in this, imagine there wasn't a finger, but like a whole hand. She just lost a whole hand, but it kept being alive. It kept being active. And this is imagining that this tale is a much cooler story than what my mom told me. And it's called The Unconfirmed Miracles at Puriquequara, which is the town that she is from. First came reports of a leprous child who touched the shrunken hand and was healed. A barren woman pressed it to her womb and conceived. Other claims followed. A manioc crop flourished when a farmer danced with the hand over his field. A priest cast out a possessed boy's demon when he used a finger to make the sign of the cross on the boy's body. Whenever a believer paraded it down church aisles, the square holes in Christ's wrists closed. The man who discovered the shrunken fist in the mouth of a dead jaguar said his manhood doubled in size. I knew where it had come from. This message that my daughter's body was still alive and surely growing, but I said nothing. The town had waited so long for a miracle, and it was finally here, enriching the poor, emboldening the meek, carving acrostic mysteries into trees. So when I caught it trying to escape the reliquary, I thought I had no choice but to leash it to the altar. That's when the manioc crop molded, and the woman delivered a stillbirth with flipper for feet and eyes like small black planets. Demons returned to the boy. He shook so hard he struck his head on a rock and died. When the hunter went mad and strangled his wife, the town was relieved. We knew what to do. We paraded him to the city square where he wept, "Where's my wife?" And the priest prayed, "Deliver us." And we all shouted, "Thief," until his body stopped swaying and we cut off his hands. Startled pigeons roosting on the church roof took flight when they heard the clapping. So this whole thing started with me saying, it's not about my mom. But she died when I was in the middle of writing this book. And I was like, okay, it's about my mom. But of course, like everything that happens in this book is fictionalized. It sometimes has little seeds of things my mom said to me, but it's in no way meant to be a representation of her life. And in fact, I hadn't been to the town in Brazil she was from until after she died. Then I went down there and finally saw the place I'd been imagining and fake writing about this whole time. So in this book, there are different voices. It does a family tree backwards, because once I realized it was about my mom, I realized all of these voices that I'd been writing about, which I thought were just members of a town, were part of a family. So there's a family tree in the book, and as the book goes on backwards, the family tree gets filled in. It starts with just 2 names, and then it goes backwards through time to discover different family members. These are fake family members. It's not my family. But this one is the husband of the last speaker. It's called, let's see, is there anything else? He's a missionary and married her. She married him because he would pay for her father's funeral. But she won't convert. So he married her and she won't convert. And so he keeps trying to do things to get her to convert. And she keeps not doing it. And he starts doing uglier and meaner things in order to like get her to love God. I don't think this is a good strategy, but that's what this guy's up to, and this poem's called Atonement. I chose my death on a black day in June when rain came in sideways from the windows and my wife lay unmoving on the floor. I'd lived for 3 years in my silence, the faithful beseeching my dumb mouth for a revelation. Heaven is cheap, I wrote across the book of Luke. all God wants is for you to think of loaves and fish when you dance. I don't blame anyone for leaving me except my wife. Her hips used to charm the hay eyes out of a man's pocket, but now she sleeps with cows, and when she brings me coffee, black, sweet, and steaming, she smells like piss. Maybe I tried to teach her a lesson, but I never meant the pain to last. To ask her forgiveness, I snuck onto the plantation and astonished a rubber tree, reopening its cuts and collecting its sap in my hands. I want to shape it into a heart, but it pooled into moonlight. It rolled into a ball. It tried to become a kite, but it became a burning book. I knelt before it and whispered, "Show me my enemy, and I will sew her lips shut until she submits or unmakes the world." When I went home, my wife told me someone set fire to the plantation. Everyone would starve this season. I tried to make her hold still so I could pierce her lips with a needle. "God loves you," I said, and finally believed it. She kissed me with her bloodied mouth and went to feed the cows. I painted my lips with sap and went to save the trees. "My God," I said, and the fire said yes. Fun fact about Brazil, rubber plantations weren't a thing. People used to just tap the rubber trees and collect it, and you could sell it because like rubber was this like great crop. But it became this great source of wealth at the turn of the last century. And Henry Ford tried to set up rubber plantations there, but like the trees wouldn't grow as well in those rows. And they tried to force everybody to work a 9 to 5 and eat meat and potatoes, which is not the diet or reasonable work hours in the tropics. And then once they were like, "Oh, we get it, we suck at this," then everybody like got into like normal work rhythms and got to eat their own food. And things went a lot better when they didn't try and impose American values on other people. So just pro tip, should you ever want to start a plantation in another country, listen to the people that you want to work for you. So I was visiting another class who'd read my book, and they're like, "You have a greater than usual amount of devil sex in your book." And I was like, "What's the usual amount?" But they were really fascinated by the fact that I'm not making this stuff up either, there's a pink river dolphin in the Amazon. Legit, in the Brown River, pink dolphins, and they're called botos. And supposedly they can turn into men. And if you meet a nice man at the fire and you're doing your little dance and you're hanging out and he's got a hat on, you might want to lift up his hat before you go off to the woods to do a little hanky-panky, because it might be a dolphin, and the forehead is the giveaway. So if you check and there's no blowhole, you're good to go. But it could be this pink river dolphin that's known for seducing young women from fishing villages. Because he's going to be gone in the morning and you're never going to see him again. So one of the things I like about the devil and the devil sex in my book, it's just with the dolphin, it's not the devil. But that the devil is on team consent, not that there's any other team to be on, but any early American lit, the devil's always "Oh, witches, come have saucy devil sex and do that. But he always gets to tempt, but you get to choose, right? God's just gonna be "Nope, you're gonna have my celestial baby," or whatever. But the devil's "I'm just gonna tempt you with my, or if you've seen the movie Witch, Black Phillip's "What about this life of butter?" It's all about temptation. And consent, but there's still consent. So this is a poem to reduce your likelihood of seduction by the boto. Do not swim. Do not swim in moonlight. Do not swim naked in the moonlight. Do not swim in the floral bikini you ordered from a catalog. Do not walk too close to a river, or he may have his hand on your ass and call you sweetheart before you know it. He wants your legs wrapped around his waist, though he may settle for you stroking his flippers and tossing him fish. For now. But do not row your canoe across the river. Do not row your canoe across the river without a chaperone. Row your canoe across the river with a chaperone who's been seduced before and knows the warning signs of swooning. Do not fall for his wholesale sadness. Cut your hair, change your name. Do not accept an invitation to dance from a hatted figure trying to pass for a man. You're his type because he's never seen you before. You must be new in town or someone's wife. Do not sing fados even under your breath. Do not recite soliloquy about your fondness for deviant romance on the docks. Do not think your fetish will turn him off. He's done stranger things and with less pleasure. He needs consent at every button, hook, zipper, and tie, but he has pornographic lips and the patience of a 1,000-year-old myth. Do not imagine his favorite positions. Do not imagine his favorite positions are the same as yours. Do not imagine him kissing the cysts in your earlobes. He's imagining that right now. Do not trust the dark advice of the leash. Though you have the upper hand, he can't die until he collects the yeses of every woman in town. Do not leave your front door unlocked, or he will arrive, quick as an angel at a virgin's bedside. The coming so sudden it won't let you go until it receives your blessing. His release as easy as your pleas. The wife of the missionary has sex with the dolphin. Well, because her husband wouldn't sleep with her until she converted, and so she didn't. It's not good. So this book goes backwards in time, in part because it ends with this really bad marriage and the loss of this child. And he didn't want to write a book going forward in time that would end in this really tragic way. So it starts with the tragic stuff and goes backwards in time because I wanted the book to end with love. So this is going back to the childhood of the first speaker. And she lost her mom kind of like I did. The fate of my 7 dolls. Wait, just checking. Nope, there's a thing you have to know. Who watches extreme fishing shows? One person! Yes! Okay, one person might know this fish. It's called the pirarucu. This thing is giant. It's this huge, monstrous fish. And not just its teeth are freaky crazy, but its tongue is so rough that they sell them as what are those, pumice stones to scrape your heels and stuff? The tongue is that rough that you can buy dried pirarucu tongues at markets and stuff. It's a crazy big fish. So the pirarucu, you have to picture this really giant monstrous fish that you'd have to wrestle to get out of the Amazon. And a hibareño is it's a person who lives on the river, like a fisherman person with living that river life is a hibareño. The fate of my 7 dolls. They arrive from America the day of the funeral, seams in their dresses unfinished, glue behind their eyes loosened by heat, blue gazes rattling plastic heads, and the priest thanks Providence before giving them to me at my mother's funeral. I dress them in mourning, scold them as I brush their hair. A capuchin steals one from the cradle I made out of a plantain crate. The one with the parted mouth I kiss with the tip of my tongue until my father gives it away, knowing nothing of the one I buried after I broke my hymen on its hand. One was a mermaid's daughter who drowned, but her body washed up where a handsome guitarist found her and massaged her feet until her heart started. I nail one to a cross as a gift for the priest. I open one with a kitchen knife to see how girls are made and rub my finger along the smooth, hollowed shoulders and hips and thighs. One I dress in mud and forget it by the river. The tide takes it to a curious pirarucu, and when the hibareño cuts into his boiled dinner's belly that night, as he argues with his wife about the last time they made love during a full moon, a naked plastic girl spills onto his plate, slicked in blood and fish guts. Ay Deus, she cries, but it isn't God at all. Ay Maria, she cries, which is closer to the miracle born on their table. A single blue eye, crooked in its socket, stares back. The wife grabs a stick and pushes the hard, unbreathing body back through the slit in the fish's belly. They'd asked for a son. So the mother mentioned in that one, who had already passed away, as you go further back in the book, she marries a parrot smuggler, and the parrot smuggler was born in the miraculous way that appears in the next poem. It's called After the Flood, the captain of the Hamadryas discovers Madonna. So the Hamadryas is named after the Hamadryads, which are tree nymphs that were young women in Greek mythology that turned into trees. Just trying to see if there's anything else that might be useful to know. No, I think that's all you need. After the flood, the captain of the Hamadryas discovers a Madonna. He pulled everything he could save out of the water: canoes snarled in tree roots, bruised mangoes, cans of chilies, crates and crates of plantains splitting from their tough yellowed skins. before he found her, upside down in a Encyclopedia, robed in mud and fish bones, a woman's floral underwear wrapped around her feet. He wiped dirt from between her lips with his calloused thumb and felt what he dreaded, a god-awful abundance of wonder. Town after town he towed the Mother of God, but no one would take her. One town said it lost a Christ with paint flaking from his face. Another said they lost cattle to the river. Another, a child. He offered the blooming peony panties to every shaking head. For weeks he rode through storm and sunstroke, promised her to God the glory, to God the power, to you the devotion of a penitent thief. But she remained unclaimed. Macaws landed on her shoulders and sang whale songs. When he cupped her smaller breast, he heard bells tolling his own name. Morphos cloaked her at dusk, mated on her back, or slipped their proboscises deep and tenderly beneath her blistered paint for the sweetness seeping from her warped hips. One night, as he passed a boat where men laughed as they threw rotting fish at caimans, her peeling cheeks smoothed, her splinters lay back into the wood, her belly rounded against the robe, the child inside turning as it dreamed its own heartbeat. Then he saw, then he sorrowed, then the shameless mortal awe as he cried, "For thine is the kingdom," and rolled up his sleeves to deliver her. Yeah, it seems like if you're like born of a tree nymph, then you should have like a good gift for like talking to birds, which the guy does, and then he steals them and smuggles them. It's not good what happens to parakeets. So before all that, at the turn of the 20th century, the rubber boom in Brazil was so crazy big that it was, the city of Manaus was the center of wealth for the entire planet. Like, people there would send their laundry to Paris. That's ridiculous. But like, that was the level of like such extreme wealth that was happening there as people were finding rubber. And so if you go back a couple generations in this family, you find a rubber baron, which is what they were called. This guy was in love with an opera singer. And they really did, I have to double check these facts, but there was one opera season when like 13 members of the opera died from yellow fever. Well, like there are these like horrible diseases in the tropics as well. And so like that also ended up taking out a lot of people, even as there's this giant pink opera house in the middle of the city in the jungle. And like they still sometimes do perform opera, but at the time that was the big thing. And they even had the paving stones were actually all rubber so that the clatter of the carriages would not disturb the opera performance. Let's see, anything else to know? The lines that I'll quote that he says are actually from the opera Lucia de Lammermoor, which is a woman who loves a man she shouldn't, as always. And her family's like, no, you should marry this guy. And then her family murders her beloved on her wedding night, and she falls downstairs covered in blood when she finds him. It's a very famous mad scene. If you've seen Fifth Element, the crazy blue lady sings the aria. But anyway, these are some of the words from it. This is called the Hunger River, which is the name of the Rio Negro, because the tannins in the water are very different. So they were like, the Amazon has all this life. This river, you'd stay hungry. But it's a different ecosystem because of the tannins in the water. But everybody thought that was the river you went up to starve. The Hunger River. It was named long before I shot my horse for trying to follow me, but that's all anyone remembers, how I went mad when my beloved died. Even though I nursed her through yellow fever, my body remained strong enough to carry her to the grave. I used to bring her orchids and write maracujá. She'd sing private arias in her dressing room while I kissed the insides of her knees. I'd rest my cheek on the hairs of her calf, close my eyes and hear each note travel down her chest, round her hips, and roll through her legs to my waiting ear. A crooked crescent moon scar carved itself on her left patella one night when she snagged her skin on an exposed nail during a performance. As she stumbled and cried out, the audience, believing it was grief that crippled her, wept harder. After they buried her in a Lucia costume, I fed my horses champagne, set fire to my villa, and rode out alone to the Hunger River. One horse got free and followed me from shore. When the trees began to thicken, it jumped in and swam behind me as I raved, I surrender to you. I have escaped from your enemies. But the horse did not turn back, even when I took out my gun. Adoration is awful, I thought. Water rushed through the bullet hole and into the skull like a blessing. The horse's skeleton can still be found, white, impossibly radiant, aspiring to immortality at the bottom of the river. An eel made its home in the rib cage, flicking its black tail between the bones. And the last one I'll read is from his section too, and it's When the Opera Singer is Alive, because it all goes backwards. So everyone who died basically gets to come back. The book is a little obsessed with resurrection, because if you read backwards, then everyone's alive again. So if you're like, that was so confusing, everything you just explained, you just read exactly backwards through the book, and you're like, gotcha, now that's moving like time normally should. But I don't think there's anything else I have to explain for you to know what's happening in this poem. It's just a love poem about some crazy dude in love with an opera singer, because beauty is very seductive. Idyll, or impossible epithalamium, and I guess I will explain that. An epithalamium is a love poem written on the eve of a wedding. It's usually advice for how to have a lasting love. We know the end is near. Rumors reach us of the seeds smuggled, and other rubber barons begin hoisting their grand pianos on steamboats, loading their opera glasses and linen suits in trunks. But our story's conclusion seems so far away in these afternoons, when I sell taxidermied piranhas to tourists, while she steals beauty magazines from the drugstore. Our fantasies are not wishes, but sometimes as she sleeps, I measure her for a wedding dress. Sometimes I wake and find valentines on my chest. I pick a maracuja for her, she picks a jambu for me, and we pretend love is this simple, that make-believe equals anonymity equals romance. We swear we belong only to each other and invent our futures. A future of children and Atlantic seas, a future of oracles and flights, of mysteries naming themselves, of infinite pink seductions. Even an arrogant imagination runs out of fantasy. But for now, our story is in its second act and building. For now, I remain her afternoon samba. She stays my sweet disobedience, my happily, my ever, my soon.
Thank you, Traci. That was awesome. I learned so much. Hey, we're gonna just take a 5-minute break. Check out the books. Go eat a cookie.
I just wanted to thank Wayne State and Chad for having me up here. This is great. I drove up from Omaha. It's a great time of year to travel. So yes, I'm really excited to be here. So I'm gonna read a few poems from my most recent book, What the Night Numbered First. And I am one of those poets who like to work under a project. I feel more comfortable if I have this sort of umbrella over me. So in this book, What the Night Numbered, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It sort of simultaneously retells two stories at the same time. One of those stories is it retells the myth of Cupid and Psyche, very famous Greek and Roman myth. And it also retells the events of the Stonewall riots of 1969. And if you don't know, the Stonewall riots were a series of riots that took place in New York City and Greenwich Village, in particular summer. And during the riots, these sort of riots took place outside of this gay bar called the Stonewall Inn. And it was sort of the habit of the police at this time. They were gearing up for an election year, so the sort of political officials were sort of having the police sort of raid these gay bars and sort of taking all the sort of patrons to down to the station and arresting them, and their names would be in the paper, and they would lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really bad scene. The book sort of retells the story of the participants of those riots. And I thought I would sort of begin reading in the last section of the book, which is during the riots, because political unrest and protest seems like a good place to start these days. This first one I'm going to read, just to give you some context for the riots. This poem is taking place, when the police on this particular day raided the Stonewall Inn, for whatever reason, and there's like a lot of debate about why this particular day was the day that these gay and lesbians sort of started to fight back. So they were taking everybody out into the paddy wagons and sort of preparing to cart everybody to jail. And there was these sort of crowds that were sort of forming outside the Stonewall Inn. And the Stonewall Inn was sort of a dive bar, and it only had one entrance and exit, the front door. So as the crowd started to turn and started to turn on the police and sort of push back, the police were sort of forced back inside the bar, and at that point they had nowhere to go. They were sort of trapped inside. So this poem starts at that moment where the police are trapped inside the bar. And it is entitled, "I Heard They Were Queer for One Another." The police were boxed inside the stone wall once the crowd shifted its hips and cut with their collective eyes. I heard the mood changed outfits, queens calling out the girls escorted from the bar. "Have a good rest. Those bags under her eyes have been packed for weeks." Waving them off, bon voyage. Then a thing happened no one's quite sure of, but I can only assume it began as a stirring of something in the crotches of the blue boys, as the queens batted their lashes like they wanted it hard, and the blue were happy to oblige. The tide turned so suddenly, some heavenly lifeguard absent from his post, and the raids began. First pennies, then nickels, dimes, quarters, the economic escalation of violence, till the queens minted stranger currencies, bricks, curses, fire. I heard it happened in the stone wall, the doors locked, the police huddled together. Heard it started with the stroking of a holster, a rookie talking dirty to the bar's only exit, that it turned as catty as a bitch decked to the nines in a heat wave. I heard they stood close enough to kiss during the worst of it, wetted their lips and stared into each other's eyes. How they wanted to say things, talk about their wives and children, their guns, their cocks. I heard they felt each other tremble as the windows shattered, moved closer as the floor shuddered with each thrust of something on the door. Then the flame took, and they were in a moment one breathing, sweating animal, red hot with life in its belly. They heard the orders of their superiors, "Nobody fire, help is coming." They thought about what it meant to do this together, to stand shoulder to shoulder, their guns half raised in a circle jerk right out of nightmares. The fairies now tigers, bottom now top, cocktails burning, and I heard it was the queerest thing. Back up a little bit. So the main character in this book is a character that named Psyche. And she is sort of like, this street kid in New York. Like, one thing about the Stonewall riots is that the participants of the riots were actually these street kids who had oftentimes sort of come to New York and sort of, or came to the great anonymity that is New York because they were sort of turned out by their families and they had nowhere else to go. And they just sort of heard from these small towns in Nebraska or Tennessee or what have you, that you could go to New York and there were gay and lesbians there and you could live your life. So they end up sort of, getting on a bus, coming to New York with nothing to their name. And a lot of them, since they didn't have, very young and didn't have resources, would sort of get together with other gays and lesbians in the area and just sort of form these sort of street gangs that would take care of one another. And it was really these gangs that sort of, were the ones who kind of instigated the riots in a lot of ways. So Psyche is a member of one of those gangs. Another character in, like you mentioned in this poem, Zazu, is sort of her mentor, the person who sort of took her under her wing when she came to New York. But this is called Psyche Incites the Riot. This I brought upon myself. All of us, newly returned from the edge of the underworld, the body going under, but not the voice. You know the story, the flags of Fire Island hung at half-mast. When the swine came, their boots blackened, buckles spit-shined until they flared under the naked bulbs. It was us that were corralled. No cowboys with their silver guns, angel hands, were there to keep the peace. Zazu, as she is cuffed and led away, sings Hello Bluebird, and the girls with their manhood tucked and taped mouth the echo. We are constituted by an absence of voice, a lust for tenor. Grief is the thickest of greases, and what it covers is clay and steel, graffiti, a faint penny taste in our mouths. We have bitten our tongues like raw mothers. We have birthed ourselves, hemmed by everything we have borne. The veils have been pulled from our faces, and we are using them as shields. I should have mentioned the reference to Hello Bluebird there is sort of like part of the mythology that surrounds the Stonewall riots. Judy Garland, a very famous gay icon, who was most famous for playing the role of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, died sort of a few weeks before the Stonewall riots took place. And it's sort of conjectured that part of why this was the day that the gays and lesbians sort of turned and sort of fought back against the police was because of this sort of collective grief of the loss of this sort of gay icon that was Judy Garland. But the last poem I'll read from this collection is kind of one of the last poems of the book. It sort of takes place after the riots are over. It's sort of these street kids kind of coming out on the next day to find out what has sort of happened in the aftermath of the riots. And this one is called How Queens Lose Their Looks. How strange it is to be unafraid, to learn that in the aftermath of violence there's beauty, windows recut into sapphires, polish of wet charcoal, the solemn smoking embers. When the riot trucks left, they gave up the street to the dawn. We walked out again. Those who had not been taken by the raid, all of us nursing wounds of one kind or another. Black eyes, a broken nail, the sculpted nothing left in the place of so much pain. It wasn't nothing exactly, though. Our lives not entirely undressed. Zazu couldn't stop grinning, her cheeks swollen. Tommy kept repeating, "Scandalous. Did you see them running? Did you see them shit their pants?" This must be what it's like. The sacrifice paid, the blood dried, flaking, the blade still wet. And the faces of the exalted, the ones left after, feverish, their limbs still itching with it all. We walked as if dazed, drugged, our feet finding familiar paths, the circuit of the park, the square, looping back always past the gutted ruin of the stone wall, the smoke still rising like a thought bubble in a comic, what you could read on everyone's face printed there, what our lips couldn't form. The stone wall is gone. The stone wall is gone. No one could stand still, so we walked on past the window dressings and marquees, the headlines newly inked, past silence loitering on the Saturday morning streets, and the officers patrolling, eyeing us up and down, swinging their sticks. There we were in that new city. There we were strolling our avenue, none of us dropping our eyes to our feet. So I wanted to read some from my this new manuscript that I'm working on, and I have to say that I'm really glad that Traci read about dolphin sex, because I'm going to be a little bit brave, moving into this project. So the new project that I'm working on is, since the book What the Night Numbered dealt so much with this aspect of femininity, and I wanted to my new collection to sort of look at the opposite side of that and take a sort of gander at masculinity and how it's sort of configured. So this new project that I'm working on, I began I started writing these poems on James Bond. I grew up, my mother loved James Bond. She was a big fan. And as I was doing this work on James Bond, one of the things that I get to do, I teach at Nebraska Western University in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we're sometimes asked to teach these classes called the Archway Seminar, which is sort of this introduction, get students to think about how do you do research in college and that sort of thing. And you can do it on your own theme. So it's a really exciting class to teach because you can just pick a theme and run with it. So when I was working on this project, I decided, well, I'm just going to do James Bond. Because I was doing all this research and why not? And as I was sort of researching for this class, one of the things I learned that was kind of fascinating is that Ian Fleming, who is the author of the James Bond spy thrillers, was actually very much into BDSM. And if you watch or read the James Bond movies or books, it makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, James Bond is always sort of being captured by the villains, and they put them in this weird sort of elaborate torture apparatus, and there's this weird sort of eroticism, homoeroticism that sort of at play there. The new film Skyfall sort of played with this as such a common thing. So I wanted to sort of explore this idea of masculinity, but I also started doing research into BDSM culture and sort of looking at how masculinity, how power is sort of negotiated in those sort of dynamics. So this is sort of a long preface to get into this idea that in this collection there are poems about James Bond, and there's these other poems where I create this sort of persona of a sub in a BDSM relationship who is in a relationship with his partner, and their relationship is on the rocks because his partner has committed an infidelity, and they're trying to heal their relationship. And they have the bright idea, well, BDSM is all about trust, so maybe we can heal our relationship by getting into those practices. So those are the two sort of prefaces to these poems. And I'll read one of the James Bond poems first. And this is sort of an introduction to him. Everybody sort of knows James Bond for his drinking habits. Of course, James Bond prefers a martini, shaken, not stirred. But actually, in the first book, Casino Royale, it wasn't until later when the movies came out that the sort of association of James Bond to the martini became sort of iconic. His first drink of choice is actually the title of this poem. So if you're looking for new drinks, here it is. 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of Quina Lillet. Bond awakes from the dream to the parrots fighting. The trees overhead dissecting lights, his drink now warm. He has a name for this feeling. He's bored. Always a dangerous place to be. 3 months on a Jamaican beach, and the blonde stepping out of the surf to wave at him is already familiar. Her body colonized, resources depleted. His body is recovering. The bullet pulled from his thigh, now nothing more than a dimple where his thumb can rest, bruises the color of lemon rind. His mind nearly calmed. Bond watches as a native at the prow of a small boat, the lad's body leaning out over the place where water decides to be wind, spray captured in the net of his hair. He's been deep in it, ordered R&R, and that repeating dream where the gun fires, its source unknown, but the bullet surely en route to the mark, and always he wakes to a stranger world. The nightstand, broken tumblers, her. All of it queerly monstrous, as if he discovered the mystery of hardware under his skin. Bond is accustomed to being controlled, his movements stuck in a dossier. But the other morning, he listened to a child tell his nurse a story. How the boy ended it, the man never seen or heard from again. He downs the drink, hot as piss. He isn't buying any of it. The light fish scaling the water, parrots preening. It's a law of dispersal that the older you get, the more you feel tied to names, places. Poor bastard. And it's as if he's telling those birds that every time you touch an object, it disappears a little more, the fumes hung up in the glass. There's nothing cleaner than a drink done properly. Amber, ice, the shape that shapes it. Bond stands, sights the blonde, limp as a seal in the surf, turns his back on the scene, and heads inland, where he'll find his gun, passport, his tailored suit. The parrots take flight, and Bond wants their squawks to be speech, words that cry warning or an introduction. Hello, pretty bird. Danger, danger, hello. So going to the other side of this sort of a relationship of a sub and dom who are sort of working through these problems in their relationship. This next poem sort of takes place at the instant where the sub, the sub partner in this gay relationship, finds out about the affair or the affairs that have been going on. And this one is called Our Affairs. The morning after you confessed you'd been unfaithful, hands roaming in the breathy dark of a parked car, I moved from room to room like a sleepwalker in a house of familiar edges. The furniture always exactly where you expect it to be. I watched the light from the blinds change, go dim and then searing, then check the pockets of your jeans for slips of paper, business cards. The day The day found me across the street at a payphone, calling numbers found in the litter of drawers, years old, hand pressed to ear against the chug of traffic, receiver dialing out to any voice. What would I have said had there been an answer on the other end? I don't know if it was guilt I searched for or a voice with a catch, someone to remind me my name and its proximity to yours. Reaching no one, I ended up at the swing set in back of our lot, all the bars solid, primary colors, as if to say, we insist. At the start of the meadow just beyond, musk thistles were undressing, goldfinches pilfering the seas like sleek money changers. The night before, once silence stepped into the space our voices had exhausted, you asked me if you'd ruined everything. Surely not so much as all that. I feel it necessary to tell you what happened next. At the edge of the lot, a rabbit sat, as if waiting for a reason to exist, and for the world to forget that it did. Then a calico, concealed in grass, charged. The two beat away, startling me on the swing and nearly overrunning me, now watching the one pursue the other, a pair of thundering, resentful hearts. My failing was to take this as metaphor, but to what end? Between the furred purse carrying life and the claw tracking, there's no meaning, no solace, just a resolution, the faint cry from the margins, and the silence after a dial tone, and those finches, those lawless, black-capped brokers embattled over the field's hot spoils, who I'm sure could guess to an ounce what's left of this loud and quickened heart. So I'm going to be a little brave with this one. So, the next poem I'm going to read is I felt like as I was writing this, the BDSM culture is all about consent. Which I'm glad Traci brought that up as well, right? It's one of the catchwords of the day, and thank God it is finally. Yes, in BDSM culture, since you're sometimes performing these sort of sexual acts that can be a little rough, can be a little dangerous, there's all this sort of sense that you need to negotiate consent. You had to be sort of negotiating sort of these power dynamics at all time. And as I was sort of working on this project, I was sort of doing research in the gay and lesbian community of Omaha, sort of meeting people who were sort of self-identified as kink and leather and BDSM and what have you. So I was kind of gathering sort of stories from them. So I have to sort of dedicate this poem to my friend Travis. And the title of this poem is called Safe Words. I'm assuming everybody knows what a safe word is. I will sort of mention that. So with the safe words, usually you don't want it to be something like stop, because if you're doing sort of a role-playing scene, stop can actually be sort of part of the role-playing. So it needs to be something sort of just ridiculous, something so out of the norm that if you mentioned it during sex, it would just be it would be so unusual that it's okay, that's definitely the safe word. We come at Reese's point. So with that preamble, safe words. Sir, I've only used it once. Flamingo, the word that means stop. Only once in a basement dungeon, spread across the sling's cupped hand. I felt as if I was hung over nothing, the poppers pinning me to a point of focus, the sway over all I could not perceive. The two men who'd invited me, one with his fist inside me, the other with the riding crop he was using to stipple my chest, merely a common sense behind the blindfold's thin curve. Suddenly it was all too much. The heat-excited veins in my skull, the too many hands reaching, all of me taken with the need to decant into a shape that might hold me better. So I said flamingo, the word we'd agreed upon. The two of them laughed and did not stop, the one with the crop striking harder. Perhaps they'd not heard. Then the thing I'd pleaded for, the blindfold, the restraints, pinning my hands above my head, became a kind of accusation. Hadn't I asked for this? So I said it again, flamingo, and then stop. They didn't. Driving home that night, once they'd finished, once I was let out of the restraints, the sling, the home they shared, I'd watched stars slip the grasp of silhouetted trees, and I thought about a fact I'd learned, that the light of some of those bodies was just warmth fleeing what was already dead. I thought to make a lark's head tie, you fold the rope in two, form a lark's head, wrap the tails, pull through the bite. To the imprint of that knot on my wrist, I argued, Hadn't I gone there with the intent of doing exactly what we'd done? And after all, flamingo, such a silly word, an image of a lake crowded with pink questions, not commands. And again, hadn't I? Months later, at a bathhouse in Chicago, in a sauna with men I'd never have greeted, older than me by too many years, I let them all take a turn. Asked for it even. The waters of the sauna, eventually a grime that itched when it dried. I came back from it. Friends who helped me relearn the comforts of being tied to a place. Release that follows after pain. Sir, this is all just to say that sometimes we can be wedded to the hand that undoes us, and that if into these ties I should speak a word that singes, born in the wake of a body and its limits, I'll expect you to hear how it retreats even as it advances, how very far it has had to travel to be stilled. Keep the knife ready. Sometimes I crave the sound of ropes fraying, the form shed, around me so many ends, like the wrung necks of beautiful birds. I'm going to read one more piece. So as I was working on this collection about James Bond and sort of working with all these materials, one of the things that, like, if you've ever read like the novels by Ian Fleming that feature the James Bond character, they're sort of products of their time, and they're in a lot of ways really unpalatable. They're sexist and racist, and they're just sort of like they're not PC by any means. So as I was writing these poems, I started sort of also writing about these moments where I was myself not at my best. These sort of moments where I was not my best person. So I felt that way I could sort of identify with Bond, who is also oftentimes not his best person, and oftentimes because of like the sort of sort of persona of masculinity that James Bond sort of presents to the world. So this is like a poem about a relationship that I was in that I should have gotten out of way faster than I did, and it is called Sins. I used to date a boy in Loudon, Tennessee, who once took me out to the pasture behind his parents' house, midsummer heat, life loud in the dry grass. In the shade of some live oaks, their hindquarters jerking, hair either slick with sweat or just glistening, stood a court of horses, 5 in number. The boy had pointed out a dark bay, black as the skin of wild grapes, and said, that one there's mine, name's Nigger, for the time he threw me when I was 8. It feels odd now to admit that I had heard him, how the moment rested there, taut, like a yellow jacket shooed from the open flesh of a peach. What could have possessed me, one might ask? And it was a kind of possession. We spent that summer making love in his old room, the boy trying to convince me that the house's other occupants were all tongueless and deaf. Once his mother had come and knocked on his shut door. The two of us inside, a bottle of his grandfather's homemade wine leaned against the boy's bare stomach between us, taste of it sour on his lips, like metal or soiled jeans. She had said in a voice too clipped, "It's a lovely day, don't you want to take your friend outside?" As if we were still children, boys. The boy 21 and me a year older, so I guess we were. Too young to know the weight of the thing we were doing, how loudly it whispered, his hands pressing me down to the bed, his dark hair just out of his eyes. That's how we ended up in the pasture, the boy's mother watching from the house. She knew what I was, what it meant that her son had brought me here to the house he grew up in, although she kept her mouth tight as nut hulls. I'm not sure now whether she was able to see us through the low trees, but hoping and not hoping she might, I hooked a finger into the back pocket of her son's jeans, tied against his ass, as we wore them then. I remember thinking he was too beautiful for me, too perfect. The way he carried himself, the set of those hips, the easy drawl, the way he held my arms behind my back when he turned to kiss me, hurting me a little, although I did not tell him as much. How we easily fell into that position, as if practiced, as if each of us knew our place. Thank you all.
Oh, we making it? We got one more reader. Can't stay alive. I mean, Sex and Dolphins and James Bond and Bondage. I mean, it's gonna be tough. I don't know what's in store next. So up next we have our final reader, and it's Nebraska State poet Twyla Hansen. She's the co-director of Poetry from the Plains and Nebraska Perspective. Her newest book is Rock Tree Bird, which is available back there. 2 previous books have won the Nebraska Book Award. Her book, Potato Soup, was selected as a Nebraska 150 Notable Book. Her writing is published in Academy of American Poets, poets.org, Poetry Out Loud Anthology, Prairie Schooner, Midwest Quarterly, Organization and Environment, Encyclopedia, The Great Plains, and more. She and her husband live in Lincoln on a wooded wildflower and wildlife-friendly acre, which won the Mayor's Conservation Landscape Award in 1994. I'm glad we have you back, Twyla. Come on up here.
Thank you, Chad. And thank you, Traci and Stephanie and Bradford. Awesome readers and readings. And is it hot in here? Or is it just me?
No, we can't open the windows.
Okay. Whew, steamy. But wonderful. Wonderful to hear these words. And thanks for Wayne State College for inviting me. I've been here before, and I'm always glad to come back because you have the best audiences ever. I mean, this room is amazing. And appreciate that. And we writers appreciate that, don't we? So, all right, I'm going to start with potato soup. And it's my job now, after all that, to bring it down a little bit. So this is set on a prairie near Lincoln called 9 Mile Prairie. And it took place right after 9/11. I wouldn't have written about 9/11. I didn't want to write about 9/11. And how do you write about 9/11? It's like Bill Clefcorn said, poetry, he defined, one of his definitions of poetry was words highly compressed, nibbling at the edge of something vast. So that's, as poets, that's what we can do. We are on 9 Mile Prairie when the news reaches us of twin towers and collapse, walking with 4th graders through tall grass, our guide uttering blue stem and goldenrod, mammal and snake, this early report not yet registering, the sun high, burning. Standing on the unplowed, the hole, no broken sod or surreal debris, only silence, learning pollination and forb, coyote and mouse, deer and split hoof adaptation. This unspoiled place, a split screen, reels replaying later, spider and insect, growth points above or below, roots with tentacles deeper than imagination. How do we comprehend fanatics? Out here, we speak French, prairie, treeless meadow evolving through the millennium. Plant, animal, weather intertwined, on each other dependent. The first people in fire following the source. 4th grade, when school grows more complex, when the curriculum includes heritage. How do we define the fear, the future, the dead? The blameless children, rabbits, bolt from predators, crouch in grass. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no Superman to reverse the Earth's rotation, start this day over. Wings in the air, the claws of terror. We pause on thatch in the brief quiet, breathe unsullied air. While winds blow our way, we search for words, phrases, language that is truly alive. Are we safe on this, our only planet? Each child becoming the smallest prey. I'm going to read the title poem to this book. This poem came out of a call for poems about potatoes. So it was a Kansas City editor, and she sent the call out, and as a writer, I thought that was a real challenge to come up with something new about potatoes. So I wrote this poem and I sent it in, and I was pretty excited about it, and of course it was rejected, but I sent it to the Prairie Schooner and they liked it, so it got published anyway. Potato soup. In the early years, she helped her mother plant peels, carry the dishpan out to the garden, digging holes. What you eat is what you plant, her mother always said. That edible tuber, common as dirt, a near daily staple. One grandmother left potato country long ago for this one. Another immigrated for the promise of more potato land. As she learned to cook, she began peeling alone at the sink, sticking a spare slice on her tongue, smell of starch lingering on her fingers. Mashed, fried, baked on Sundays for hours, regular as pulsating winds over the plains. Soon graduating to French fries and sizzling grease, to fermented spirits of the potato. Beginning with a certain look in an eye, relying on folklore, that time of month safe and planted at night under the expansive and unblinking moon. Graveling into the soil around roots to steal an eager potato or two. She's fond of the skin colors, the flesh, textures, exotic flavors. Moving on to potato saladiers, quick boiled varieties from the hot tub. Decades here and gone, potato love constant. By now, she's concluded it's best on gradual simmer, consolation accompanying maturity. In the afternoons, she sautés onion and butter, stirs in flour and milk, chops celery, carrots, adds chicken stock. She thinks of the hour when they'll be eating into twilight, of the long night ahead in front of the fire. Should she throw in something extra for tang, for play, a measure of Chardonnay? All her life, she thinks, it has come down to this, bringing the bottle up slow to meet her lips. I just wanted to add one little more thing about that poem. You know, you should never give up on your poetry, even though it gets rejected. I think every writer is getting rejections right now, right? Okay, so anyway, I gave a reading in Kansas City after this book came out, and I read the poem, and it just so happened that editor was in the audience, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, "Oh, I would have taken that poem if I'd read it," you know, so my poem didn't get past the first reader, I guess. So don't take it personally. Of course, we all do, right? I'd like to read a couple more, two or three poems from this Dirt Songs, a Plains duet. It's 50 poems of my good friend Linda Hazelstrom from South Dakota, and 50 poems of mine. And I talked her into doing this. She's mostly a prose writer, but she also writes poems. And so I talked her into putting her poems with mine, and we've been friends for a while, but she didn't know if she wanted to do it. And a couple years later, she's agreed to do it. So anyway, it turned into this nice little collection, and we didn't really talk. We didn't share our poems with each other beforehand. We just trusted each other to put, you know, we had the same kind of background, rural, and she's a ranch woman, and I came from a farm, and so we just trusted each other. It turns out there's some poem pairs in here. We had no clue about that until the book was published. So I'm going to read one of Linda's that pairs with mine. And first I'll read Linda's poem called "My Uncle Harold Makes Up His Mind." And by the way, you should look up Linda's been here before, right? And she's a terrific writer, like I said, mostly nonfiction. The house they built together booms with TV voices loud enough to fill the rooms where their children never played. Before his wife died, she said she felt like rats were eating her brain. He props his crutches against the chair, looks out the window at 30 fat Hereford cows. Since cancer took his leg, he drives the pickup while the hired man pitches off the hay. The hired man has 3 kids, lives in the little house across the yard next to the corrals. He's buying the ranch. My uncle tells me how he built that old house for his mother. Right then, he decides out loud, it's time to let the family move into the big house. He nods. I'm going to move back, he says, back to where I drove all the nails. That's Linda Hayes. And I'm going to read this poem. It doesn't go with it directly, but I consider it a pair. And this was actually published in a journal in Kearney, kind of dangerously close here. It's titled, My Husband's Grandmother Worked for Willa Cather. If you don't know, Willa Cather has a center now in Red Cloud, a national center building, and there's a lot of scholarship and everything around Willa Cather now, so Nebraska has that going for it. That was the legend. I'll start over. My husband's grandmother worked for Willa Cather. That was the legend, a string of stories passed down while she still lived. Sailed alone at age 12 from Ireland, lived with sisters in New York City until they quarreled, boarded a train for Nebraska then, alighted in her elegant threads and plumed hat at Red Cloud, all 4'10" of her oozing sophistication. The carpenter farmer falling for her at first sight. Copper-haired Kitty and hammerman Henry marrying. And this is where the tablet goes fuzzy. The classic immigrant tale turns cryptic. Devout Catholic, 4 children in 4 years, he dies. Apparently, she does what she can. Cook, wash, scrub, dust, haul, ash. I met her as the white-haired matriarch, her brogue thick and intact, her green eyes afire. She worked for the Cathers. This much is true. Only on that first day, it seems, when told she must remove her plate from the dining room, Kitty, God, I love it, turned on her heels, strode through the swinging kitchen door where lunch simmered on the stove, became the servant girl who walked from that story clean out the back door. It turns out the Cathers didn't want the servants to eat with them. What can you say? And at that time, the Irish were the workers that did all the work. Anyway, okay.